Hello, it's Scott again, back to talk about L'Aventure Ambigüe by Sheikh Hamidou. Where we left off, he had been sent back to his parents' village by the chief and the Quranic schoolmaster in order to enroll in the colonial French school and start getting a Western education for the good of his people who had felt themselves, well, not just felt themselves, they had been quickly and soundly conquered by the French and had gone from being kings of the earth as they know it to marginalized and powerless more or less, lacking the dignity that they hitherto had enjoyed. Now, I have been reading some of the writings of Jim Harries this week. Jim Harries is a teacher in Kenya who's been there for 30 years, I suppose, at least in Africa. And his big soapbox is something he calls vulnerable mission. And so he harps on the necessity of missionary workers in Africa using local languages as one thing, and also not depending on the foreign funds for their projects. But he is specifically in his dissertation points over and over and over again to the impossibility of actually understanding African worldviews and spiritual thinking in the terms of Western languages. So I feel some of the irony now of reading a book in French, albeit by a man who grew up in Africa and then was thoroughly immersed in Western education and has therefore practiced at expressing himself as well as anyone can to Western people. But I see the irony of reading a book in French, translating it into English, and then me being someone who's only ever spent 5 months in Africa trying to talk about it. I just threw out my first attempt at this video because I was having such a hard time pulling the threads together and saying anything possibly of interest. So I will try to just let the book speak for itself and let the pieces strike you as they may from Kane's book. But again, trying to digest this as I go myself. Particularly this first section I'm going to do with with far less commentary because it involves a custom among the Diallo people here, or the Dialobe people here, the Fula people, for hundreds of years, is that a young man, having completed his Quranic studies, would return to his parents' house and then in a single night, the holy night of the Qur'an, recite the entire book for his parents. And in this situation, well, I'll go ahead and read it, and then I'll say a few words at the end, but acknowledging that neither I nor probably any of you listening have experienced quite the kind of backward-looking participation with our ancestors as this, but I could be wrong. Anyway, I'm already saying too much, rambling. I'm going to read the passage. Samba softly came out of his room into the courtyard and strolled back and forth. Then, slowly began the night of the Qur'an that he offered to the night. His at first barely audible voice rose by gradations. Progressively, he felt that a feeling was engulfing him that he had never experienced before. All talk had ceased in the home. The knight, and again the knight is Samba's father, the knight, at first casually reclined, arose at Samba Diallo's voice. And it seemed now that, on hearing the word, he underwent the same levitation that raised up the teacher. Samba's mother had detached herself from the group of women and drawn close to her son. Feeling himself heard thus by the two people in the world that he loved most, knowing that this enchanted night he, Samba Diallo, was repeating for his father that which the knight himself had done for his own father, that which from generation to generation for centuries the sons of the Dialobe had for their fathers, knowing that he had not failed his duty, and that he was going to prove to all who heard him that the Dialobe would not die with him, Samba Diallo was for a moment on the verge of fainting. But he considered it more important for him than for anyone else who had come before him to fully acquit himself of this night. Because this night, it seemed to him, marked an end. This shining of stars above his head, was it not the starry bolted lock opened up to a bygone era? That was a painful sentence to translate. Behind the lock, a world of starlight shone softly, which it was important to glorify one last time. His voice had gradually risen as if bound to the advance of the stars. From the depths of time, he felt well up in him and exhale through his voice an old love now under threat. In the hum of this voice, whatever being that only moments ago had still been Samba Diallo was gradually dissolved. Imperceptibly, rising up from depths that he did not suspect, phantoms invaded him completely and took his place. It seems to him that his voice had become innumerable and muffled like that of the river on certain evenings. But the voice of the river was not as vehement, nor so close to tears. The voice of the river could not carry away that dramatic refusal that he now shouted forth. Neither did it enjoy the background accompaniment of this nostalgic chant. For a long time into the night, his voice was that of the soundless ghosts of his ancestors who he had roused. With them, he cried their death, but for just as long, he sang their birth. That passage is rather the climactic moment of participation with the universe and with his ancestors that Samba experiences in the book. Pre-modern peoples were, according to, at least he's talking about medieval peoples, in C.S. Lewis's book, The Discarded Image, they were, relative to our age, far more backwards looking. They looked to the heroes of the Homeric era, the heroes of Scripture. They saw kind of the greatest days of this present age as having happened in the past. But they saw themselves as connected to it and nourished by that past. Whereas, in general terms, in the modern West, since the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, our scientific progress has given us a sense that the world is in a progressive upward trajectory of progress, and that the best is ahead of us. Most of our ancestors we can hardly even relate to, let alone admire. We are content to ignore them or tear down their statues in some cases, which is, of course, more complicated than that made it sound. But certainly for Samba, he has a continuity not only with his past, not only with his ancestors, who he experiences as still being alive and living in him, but also that's directly mirrored in the heavens and in the firmament, which to even our ancestors was the spiritual world, not only reflected, not only represented, but embodied in the heavens, which are unchanging and undecaying and constant compared to the dynamic and changing and decaying world that we experience here below. So this is the snapshot I have of young Samba Diallo and his relationship to the universe. It is one that he will lament losing later when he's in Europe. And in the next chapter, this is the one that I had so much trouble talking about that I threw out the first video. Samba has a conversation with his father about the nature of work and its relationship to faith. And so he and his father are reading together. His father is reading the Qur'an, and he's looking at his father as his father's meditating on something. And he thinks to himself, this man doesn't even live anymore. He's just constantly in prayer. And he surprises himself with that very thought. He says, why did I conceptualize prayer and life as mutually exclusive? I gotta pause. I think Ellen and Abigail are about to get home. So at first Samba thinks to himself, this is probably due to my, there's a new part of me since I started getting a Western education that likes to categorize and dissect things and separate things and specify. But he uses his reason and he thinks to himself, okay, so the Quranic teacher, he would spend all of his time in prayer and in spiritual discipline, except when he had to cultivate his fields. Now, when he was out there, it was just using his hands, so he could still sing hymns and litanies as he worked. But my father, he works in an office, and his mind has to be engaged in his work, and if his mind is engaged in his work, then not even his mind can be turned towards God as he works. And so, doesn't work then work, contrary to prayer? Doesn't it press us in the opposite direction of prayer or away from God? And so when his father sees the wheels turning in his head and they get to talking, and Samba is wondering to himself, perhaps the West has more atheists because they're so much more obsessed with work. Anyway, how does it come up, this conversation? I've already done this once. My apologies. Yes. So his father asks him, okay, so what is the purpose of work? And he says, to preserve life. Well, essentially, as they talk, his father walks him toward the conclusion that if a life is justified upon God, if a life's purpose is knowing and worshiping God, then the work that preserves that life is, by derivation and by extension, justified upon God. So I'll read that passage as they come to their conclusion. Samba's father says, I say that all that justifies and gives meaning... I say that all that justifies and gives life its meaning, precisely thereby and a posteriori gives work its meaning. Samba. I see your conclusion. When a life is justified upon God, all that which tends to preserve it, that is, work, is itself also justified upon him. That's right. Work, in effect, is justified upon God strictly insofar as the life that it preserves is justified upon God. If a man believes in God, the time that he takes from his prayer to work is still prayer. It is even a very beautiful prayer. And that's actually a very consistent and common attitude toward work as expressed in the New Testament and in a lot of Christian teaching. The Protestant work ethic says that whatsoever you do, do for the Lord, and your work will find its place in participating in God and in knowing God and in worship. You can practice the presence of God in what you do, even if it seems a small thing. Then he adds this, and I add, though it is only the expression of a personal conviction, that a life justified upon God will not know the love of excess or exuberance. She finds her full flourishing, rather, in the conscience that she has of her smallness compared to the greatness of God. Along the way, she will grow, but that matters little to her. I use she and her because la vie, life, is feminine in French. And it sounds so much nicer even in translation. So, a life justified upon God has as its principal aim God. Therefore, its work has its aim God. And that life delights not in the accumulation of material goods, but rather in the consciousness of one's smallness and rightful, limited place in God's work in the world. She finds her joy in her smallness compared to the greatness of God. And she will inevitably grow. She will inevitably develop. She will inevitably advance and progress. But that matters little to that life, to that soul, to that man who is in pursuit of God. His real joy will be in knowing God. So then, Samba asks the obvious question, well, what then of the work of the man who does not believe in God? What purpose, what meaning does it have? And his father observes, well, if there is not a higher meaning that gives sense to the work, then finally, the ultimate reward of the work is just the material results that come from it. The exact output of the work itself. It's no longer a pious, it's no longer a religious operation. And his father observes that there was a time before the scientific and industrial revolution, I don't know if it was before, but at least in terms of what his father says, he says, at first, the Western philosophers timidly put God in quotation marks. He was started to separate God from participation in the things of the world, as they seemed to find that the world was more mechanistic. It seemed like things might be running on their own without a spiritual hand moving and guiding everything, an invisible hand. They separated the material from the spiritual, the seen from the unseen, much more sharply than those before them. And a few centuries later, it was that Nietzsche observed the landscape of the West and said, God is dead, and we have killed him. And it is from that date that the Night dates the West's frenetic work. That he says that industry is blind, even as it's able to somewhat incorporate and direct its products towards human life and human living and quality of living and medicine and such. Ultimately, the death of God announced the death of man, because, well, I'll leave it at that, because he just says the death of God announced the death of man. And then Samba says, I don't understand. His father says that there used to be an iron law that the work of one man could support the life of one man, or of one man's family. But that man's industrial and technological art has broken that erstwhile iron law. And now the work of one man can support the life of many, many men. Samba says, I don't see why that should be a problem. That should be a cause for great rejoicing, because that frees up men from work for prayer, for spiritual observance, for the pursuit of higher things. And his father disagrees. He says, no. Just at the same time that work passes from the life of a man, that it surpasses the actual concrete needs of people and frees people up for leisure and whatnot, if their lives are not already justified upon God, then the outcome of that work will have less and less relationship, less and less appropriateness, less and less affordance of the actual goods of man. Because for the Night, as for those before him, the actual good of man is to know God and to develop as a spiritual and moral being, to be conformed to the image of the Creator God. But if knowing God is no longer the motive for the work, then the work starts to, the productivity of man's labor will no longer serve man's purpose, but instead start to own man, start to feed men's appetites and impulses, and essentially the pace of technology is dragging man after it rather than man directing the direction and purpose of his work. So we already see this with, did I already give the example last week about the creation of animal-human hybrid embryos? And I think I was texting Femela about it. The scientist says, I think we have the ability to make animal-human hybrid embryos. What about that? And our ancestors would say, yeah, that's a no-no. That's monster making. And the scientist says, well, if we don't do it, China will. And so his father observes, man has never been and is nowhere so unhappy as in the times and places where he is accumulating the most. Nowhere is humanity more disdained, disrespected than the places where this accumulation is taking place. And so the history of the West seems to me revealing of the insufficient guarantee of man that man constitutes for man, i.e., Man is not sufficient to shepherd his own path, his own direction. Man does not guarantee himself. Man is not a high enough, let's say, aim to ensure that man's work will actually serve man's greatest good in the long run. And I use man because the book uses man, because that's, still pretty standard in the 1960s when this was written, and certainly when this character is speaking. He says, man's happiness requires the presence and the guarantee of God. So this is the African father's opinion on the matter, and I will conclude by reading Samba's private thoughts following this conversation, and then evening prayer, which I did translate. Samba's reflecting on the conversation, and he says, in effect, the act of faith is an act of allegiance. There is nothing about the believer that does not draw from this allegiance a special significance. Thus, the act of a believer, if it is voluntary, is different in its essence from the materially identical act of a non-believer. So too with his work. And I just, you can hear echoes of Paul. Whatever you do, do it for the Lord and not for men. The same act done with a different intention, with a different allegiance, is a materially different act. It is different in its essence from a material identical act of a non-believer, I should say, as he did. Samba Diallo stretched out on his back, opened his eyes wide on the starry firmament, which nevertheless he did not see. There is no antagonism between the order of faith and the order of work. The death of God is not a necessary precondition for man's survival. Samba himself, getting ready to go to the West, is trying to reconcile in his mind the domain of work he sees in the West, the intense focus on progress of labor, and the much more religiously focused background he's coming from. The death of God is not a necessary precondition for man's survival. Samba Diallo did not see the shining firmament because the same peace reigned in the heavens and in his heart. Samba Diallo did not exist. There were countless stars. There was the chilly earth. There was shadow. And there was their simultaneous presence. And this is like the third time, including the passage we just read where Samba feels sort of dissolved in the night sky. He's at union with nature in his heart and in his experience. It is at the very heart of this presence that thought was born, like a series of ripples on the water at the foot of a waterfall. Nagging thought, but there are those who do not believe. Samba Diallo suddenly saw the sky. In a flash, he noticed its serene beauty. Even the very fact of considering the unbelief of others causes him his first steps of separation from the heavens and from creation. There's the first poking at sort of the bubble of his upbringing. There are those who do not believe, and suddenly he sees the sky. He still appreciates its beauty, but there's a quick break, separation from it that we'll see grow in his next stages. There are those who do not believe. Can we who believe abandon our brothers who do not? The world belongs to them just as much as to us. Work is a law for them as much as it is for us. They are our brothers. Their ignorance of God must oftentimes have happened to them like a workplace accident on the construction site where our common dwelling is being erected. Can we abandon them? My God, beyond those who have lost you, can we abandon all those who from the beginning of history have never known your grace? We implore you to accept them, as you alone know how to accept whom you accept, because they have built the world with us, from which we are able, with our minds daily less preoccupied, to seek you and to greet you. It does not have to be at the cost of your grace that man conquers his freedom, does it? Thus, Samba Diallo's thoughts as he gets ready to embark on pilgrimage of sorts to Europe, to France for his philosophical education. And he gets ready to ask his father about this, but then says, I'm cold, I'm going to bed. And that's the end of part 1 of the book. There's just 2 parts to the book, by the way. This isn't going to go on forever. So, that is the end of Samba's time in Africa. Those are his thoughts in trying to reconcile already his union with nature with a totally opposite experience that he sees in the West just through what he's reading and seeing even in his education still in Africa. That's all. It's been 25 minutes. It's the longest one so far. Thanks to those who are listening. There's at least 3 of you, I think. So, and thank you for writing comments and helping me see your perspective on things too. Okay. God bless. Peace.